Those of you who haven't been here for the last few weeks, if you haven't gathered thus far from what we've done thus far in the service, we're doing a Lenten series on the 7 deadly sins. So I feel like I need to do a bit of a Netflix series kind of previously on Worship at First Church, and sorry you can't fast forward me through the previously on. Previously on 7 Deadly Sins series, we've covered greed, gluttony, and anger. And we've seen how fundamentally good desires can become distorted within us and cause all sorts of trouble for ourselves and others and ultimately separate us from our loving God. This list of the fundamental sins of our human nature, which are deadly, and number 7, comes from the desert fathers and mothers of the 4th century for the most part, and were not developed as a cudgel for shaming and convincing us of how bad we are, but rather as a tool for self-examination, for spiritual growth, for pursuing the truth about ourselves so that we might do that most difficult of things at times, change. As the writer Kathleen Norris explains, as the disciple spurns her selfish and egotistical self in favor of her true self, she comes to know better a selflessly loving God. And that's what we are working towards, to know better our loving God. So we locate those lonely, cold places where we are curved in on ourselves, as Augustine puts it. And then we see better our path towards needed change that will deepen and enrich our relationship with God and with one another. And who of us doesn't want that for our lives? The list is so powerful and so insightful an account of the human struggle, of the ways that we can become off base, that if you use it as a lens to look honestly and faithfully at yourself, you'll notice that none of us are free of the shadows of each of these sins: greed, gluttony, anger, sloth, envy, lust, and pride. And that's the page that we skipped in that little kid's book, was lust, because it was a little over the top, the description of it. And Ben and I were like, ugh, I cannot quite read that one. So in case you were wondering. But what makes that tolerable, this shining of the light through this tool of the 7 deadly sins, what makes it tolerable for us to contemplate that is the knowledge that none of us, while all of us have the shadows of those sins, none of us are without the image of God within us either. And in fact, that image of God within us is what is deeper and truer than any of the sins. So our hope is that this consideration of the 7 deadly sins during Lent will offer insight that might bear fruit for you and a pathway forward towards embracing, in certain aspects of your life, more of the virtues, the countervailing virtues, the warm places, right? And there are different lists that counteract the 7 deadly sins: generosity, temperance, patience, humility, right action, chastity, and love. That was 8. Speaking of bearing fruit, the scripture given for today was not one that we chose to go with this particular sin on this particular Sunday. It happened to be the one the lectionary chose for us. But it's a perfect stepping off point for our deadly sin du jour, which is sloth. Because one of the end results of the sin of sloth is often fruitlessness. So Jesus' parable, although it's not always interpreted this way, has the vineyard owner as representing humanity and the gardener pleading for more time and more mercy as God. The human being is quick to judge and exact punishment for fruitlessness, but God's compassions never fail, as Kathleen said in our assurance of forgiveness. God's compassions never fail. God's mercies are new every morning. What a beautiful proclamation to get up in the morning. God's mercies are new every morning. And this is so important to remember and to proclaim as we consider how these sins mar our own spirits. To remember that God is full of mercy and compassion. Jesus doesn't reject us or push us away because of our sin, but meets us in our sin and is patient with us in our failings, knowing that we can come around and change our course and be renewed every morning. And there are few of us who don't, in fact, need to be renewed from the sin of sloth. So on one hand, it might seem odd that laziness would be placed on the same list as greed and gluttony and envy and wrath. But it is. Oh, it is. And on the other hand, actually, some of the desert fathers and mothers even claimed that it was the most dangerous of the deadly sins, sloth. And then on the other hand, with our roots in Protestantism, in Puritanism and the Protestant work ethic, one might think, I get it, slothfulness should be a deadly sin. Laziness is a blight in our culture that prizes hard and dedicated work. But again, in both those instances, you would not be putting your finger quite on the point of why sloth is on the list of the 7 deadly sins. Because while it can manifest as outward laziness in work, it might often and more insidiously manifest as outward busyness. For you see, sloth becomes a distorting sin of the human spirit, not necessarily when we become lazy about the demands of work, but when we become lazy about the demands of love, of God. To say we all have this capacity for slothfulness in our lives is to say that all of us at some time or another experience the formidable demands of love and truth and goodness that require growth and change and sacrifice, and we choose an easier path. The sin of sloth can show up in the intimacy of a spousal relationship, where instead of dealing with a difficult conflict head-on and facing the tough road of coming back into relationship by acknowledging our own part, by saying, I'm sorry, by facing my own shortcomings, by doing whatever I tend to do to avoid where I really should go, like staying in my room and smoking, as the choir sang about, or staying at the office for a couple of extra hours, or coming home and getting right to a TV show, or getting busy doing something else. Actually, anything else. Rebecca DeYoung, in her book Glittering Vices, says, loving another person requires 1,000 little deaths of our individual selfish nature, and this is the work that the slothful one resists. Loving another person requires 1,000 little deaths of our old individual selfish nature. Sloth in relationships can manifest in such thoughts as, I'm fine, she's the one that needs to change, or this is not my problem, or I don't have time for this, or a myriad of other excuses for not doing the hard work that honest relationship requires. The way God made us as human beings is to be turned outward and to be self-donating towards others, whether that is our spouse, parent-child relationship, friendships, and as we know from Jesus, who demands a lot That circle continues to extend outward, even to the stranger and even to the enemy. Come on, Jesus, give me a break here. Sin turns us inward to protect what we've got. And the sin of sloth turns us inward by convincing us that the only thing that matters is in here and what I need and what I want. The famous preacher Fred Craddock speaks of the sin of sloth in this way. He says, sloth is the ability to look at a starving child with a swollen stomach and say, "It's not my child." Or to see an old man sitting alone among the pigeons in the park and say, "It's not my dad." It is the capacity, he says, of the human spirit to look out upon the world and everything God has made and say, can you turn, oh, thank you, Ben, very much. The capacity of the human spirit to look out upon the world and everything that God has made and say, I don't care. The human being is made to care. As we are made for food and water, it's necessary for us to survive. To care is a necessary aspect of what it means to be human. The human being turned in on itself doesn't care, or doesn't care enough to take the time and make the sacrifice for what is right. So I thought I had gotten out of this sin. Sloth was the sin that Reverend Judy was going to preach on. And then she had to go and slip on that ice, so she's lying in bed somewhere right now. Oh, I shouldn't even joke about that. God bless her. But I think God was like, no, Will, I think you will preach on sloth and realize more fully this sin in your life. So, but I'm not going to get confessional on you. But I did ask Judy if she had a confession that she might like to share with you all. I did ask her. I was visiting with her in the hospital, and I asked her if she had already begun developing her sermon for this particular sin, and she said yes, she had, but had many examples that she was thinking of in her life, and I asked her if I could share this one with you, because she spoke of that she said she was going to tell you the story of when she went up to her family's camp when she was a little younger, went up to her family's camp in New Hampshire, and had this good and generous impulse to wash the old dirty kitchen floor. But once she had sudsed up the floor and done a fair amount of scrubbing, she realized the job was a whole lot bigger than she imagined. What was initially a lovely expression of care for her family and their camp that made her glow in her own benevolence quickly became a big drag. So she had an idea for a shortcut. She opened the kitchen door and propped open the screen door to the backyard, hauled in the outdoor hose, and was so pleased with herself, she said, and said she even thought, I don't know why no one else has ever thought of doing this, as she turned the hose on and began to spray the kitchen floor to get all the suds and dirt and water out the door. And you can imagine how that went. It wasn't long before she realized it wasn't going to work, and that in fact she was filling up the kitchen with sudsy, dirty water, and her couple of hours of necessary work that was to complete this job of care for her family became an ordeal of many, many more hours to correct the damage that was done by the cutting of the corner. But it is a great metaphor for the path that sloth insidiously invites us down. You know, because efficiency can be a virtue, or not. It'll convince us, sloth will, that there is an easier way that involves less work and less struggle on our part. I'll just watch this Netflix program that I've really been enjoying instead of talking to my wife about that episode. An easier way in our part that involves less work but is a superficial fix that lets us off the hook for the moment from the deeper, harder, more diligent work that is required for the sake of what is good and right. Sloth is a deadly sin, truly deadly, because we suffocate the life and love that lies at a deeper level and that requires more of us and we opt for the immediate fix that is easier in the here and now. Again, Rebecca DeYoung says, the slothful person is one who resists the effort of doing day after day after day whatever it takes to keep the bonds of love strong and living and healthy, whether he or she feels particularly inspired about doing it or not. Can you find your place in this sin or its place in your life? You see how the busiest person among us could in fact be the most slothful? Do you see how slippery these sins can be and how much easier it is simply to turn these on the people around us than locate them in our own lives? It's easier to see the greed of the 1%, or the gluttony of the obese, or the anger of violent people, or the laziness of the poor, than it is to turn the light of these deadly sins on our own lives to see what they reveal about us. That very dynamic of blaming and shaming others and letting ourselves off the hook, the trying to remove the speck in our brother's eye, our sister's eye, and not even seeing the log in our own, is nothing less than an example of the sin of sloth. The deeper, harder work is to look here than it is to point outward at all the sins around us. So as I've mentioned in each one of these, each sin of the 7 is rooted in what the Desert Fathers and Mothers determined was the root of all the deadly sins, pride. For the sin of sloth is ultimately about a willful unwillingness to surrender ourselves to God, to love, to goodness. So note the willful nature of that. So we're not, right, we've got to be really clear. We're not talking about depression or grief or sorrow. I mean, that's the thing about these sins, is that they have close cousins that aren't sins. And what the church has done too often is kind of lumped it all together, right, and pointed the finger and condemned without nuancing illness and sinfulness, for instance. So the sin of sloth is ultimately about willful unwillingness to surrender ourselves to God, to love, to goodness. And instead deciding that we know how to manage our lives, thank you very much. We think we know what is required for us to live fully, so we'll take it from here. But we too often deceive ourselves, and we can even enlist, as I mentioned before, some of the virtues to support our sin of sloth. As an example, the pastor and writer John Buchanan warns and says this: sloth means not living up to the full potential of our humanity. And this can often happen by playing it safe, by entrusting nothing, by being cautious, prudent, or in other words, digging a hole and burying our treasure in it, to use Jesus' parable. If we are not careful, the virtue of prudence, for instance, can be used as an excuse for avoiding the risks that God demands of us as Jesus' disciples. So the countervailing virtues of sloth are diligence, long-suffering, and compassion. The red flags that can warn us that the work of sloth is going on within us can be whenever we feel like jumping ship due to the tediousness of a relationship or bailing on our daily discipline of prayer with God. This seems useless. I don't hear anything from God. I'm not getting anywhere. Or opting for the easier of two paths, or seeing the problem is out there instead of within. These are some of the red flag triggers. It's then worth stopping and asking if this could be the sin of sloth lurking at our door. And instead, if we notice that, then we press one more time, take one more tack to do the right thing and maintain the relationship and act on love even when, and especially when, we do not feel like it anymore. That's the way through sloth towards transformation. Risk for love, persevere for love, sacrifice for love. Risk for truth, persevere for truth, sacrifice for truth. Risk for good, persevere for what is good, sacrifice for what is good. As the gardener asked for just a little more time for the fruitless tree, we can be assured that God will give us more time if we diligently put in the needed work for change in our lives. And Jesus will meet us there at the place of our sin and our stuckness and illuminate our minds and give us the strength and the courage towards change. And then who knows what fruit might be born of that process. Amen.